February 25th, 1995. Frank Sinatra took the stage for the last time. His voice cracked. His memory failed him. But when he sang My Way, the audience cried because they knew they'd never see him again. The Palm Desert Marriott ballroom was packed. Every seat filled. People standing in the back. The crowd was different than it used to be. Older now, like Frank. These were the people who'd grown up with his voice, who'd bought his records in the 1940s, who'd screamed for him as teenagers and now brought their grandchildren to see the legend one last time. Frank stood backstage looking at himself in the mirror. He was 79 years old. The face staring back at him barely resembled the young crooner who'd made Bobby Soxers faint in the aisles. The blue eyes were still there, those famous Sinatra eyes, but they were dimmer now, tired. The face was lined, weathered by decades of late nights, cigarettes, alcohol, and living hard. His daughter Nancy stood beside him, adjusting his bow tie. "Dad, you don't have to do this. If you're not feeling up to it, I'm fine, Nancy. You forgot the words twice during rehearsal yesterday, so I'll read them off the teleprompter. That's what it's there for." Nancy looked at her father with concern. She'd been watching him decline for the past few years. The memory lapses, the confusion, the way he'd sometimes look at her like he wasn't quite sure who she was. The doctors had said it was normal aging, maybe the beginning of dementia, but Nancy knew it was more than that. Frank Sinatra was disappearing. The man, the legend, the voice that had defined American music for 50 years. He was fading away, and tonight might be the last time anyone heard him sing. "Just take it easy out there, okay? Don't push too hard." Frank smiled. That old Sinatra smile that had charmed presidents and gangsters and movie stars. "Baby, I've been pushing too hard my whole life. I'm not gonna stop now." The stage manager knocked on the door. "Mr. Sinatra, 5 minutes." Frank nodded. He took one last look in the mirror, straightened his shoulders, put on his fedora, because Frank Sinatra never performed without his hat, and walked toward the stage. The band was already playing. The conductor saw Frank coming and cued the introduction. The audience erupted in applause, standing ovation before he'd even sung a note. Frank stepped into the spotlight and the roar got louder. These people loved him, had always loved him, would always love him, no matter what. Frank raised his hand. The crowd quieted. The band played the opening notes of Come Fly With Me, and Frank Sinatra began to sing. His voice was a shadow of what it had been. The power was gone. The range was gone. He couldn't hit the high notes anymore. His voice would crack and break on them. But there was something else there now. Something the young Sinatra hadn't had. A depth, a weariness, a lived-in quality that made every word feel true. Frank wasn't just singing anymore. He was testifying, bearing witness to a life fully lived. The first few songs went well. I've Got You Under My Skin, The Lady Is a Tramp. Standards that Frank had been singing for 40 years. His muscle memory carried him through. But then, halfway through Strangers in the Night, Frank stopped, just stopped singing. The band kept playing for a few bars, then trailed off uncertainly. Frank stood at the microphone, looking confused. He'd lost his place, forgotten the words. The teleprompter was right there in front of him, but he couldn't seem to focus on it, couldn't remember what he was supposed to be singing. The audience sat in awkward silence. Nobody knew what to do. Was this part of the show? Was Frank okay? Should someone help him? Nancy watched from the wings, her heart breaking. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading. Her father, the great Frank Sinatra, lost and confused on stage in front of hundreds of people. But then Frank did something remarkable. He looked out at the audience and smiled, that old crooked Sinatra grin, and he said, "I'm old. Give me a break." The audience laughed, relieved, sympathetic. They weren't here to see perfection. They were here to see Frank Sinatra. And if Frank Sinatra forgot some lyrics, well, that was okay. He'd earned the right to forget a few lyrics after 50 years of performances. The conductor cued the band and they picked up where they'd left off. Frank found his place and kept singing. But Nancy knew, and Frank knew. This was the beginning of the end. The concert continued. Some songs went better than others. Frank remembered most of the words, hit most of the notes, made it through without stopping again. But everyone could see the effort it took, the way he gripped the microphone stand, the way he'd close his eyes and concentrate, fighting to remember what came next. And then came the final song, the song Frank always ended with, the song that had become his signature, his anthem, his statement to the world. world, my way. The band played the opening chords. The audience leaned forward. This was what they'd come for. One last time to hear Frank Sinatra sing the song that defined him. And now, the end is near. Frank's voice was rough, cracking, but there was something in it, a finality, an awareness that these words weren't just lyrics anymore. They were truth. The end really was near. This really was the final curtain. I've lived a life that's full. I traveled each and every highway. Had he? Had Frank Sinatra lived a life that was full? He thought about all the things he'd done, the records he'd made, the movies, the concerts in venues around the world, the women he'd loved, the friends he'd lost. Dean Martin, dead 4 years ago. Sammy Davis Jr., gone 5 years before that. The Rat Pack was mostly gone now. Frank was one of the last ones standing, and soon he wouldn't be standing either. Regrets, I've had a few, but then again too few to mention. Was that true? Frank had plenty of regrets. Things he'd said, things he'd done, people he'd hurt. His first wife, Nancy, who'd loved him faithfully and whom he'd left for Ava Gardner. His children, who'd grown up with a father who was always on the road, always performing, never quite there. The mob connections that had tainted his reputation, the fights, the scandals, the mistakes. But would he change any of it? If he could go back and do it all differently, would he? Frank didn't know. Maybe that was the point of the song. Not that he had no regrets, but that the regrets didn't matter anymore. He'd made his choices, lived with the consequences, and he'd do it all again the same way because it was his way. I did it my way. The audience was crying now. Not everyone, but enough. They could hear it in Frank's voice. This was goodbye. This was Frank Sinatra, 79 years old, voice failing, memory going, standing on stage singing his final song, and they would never see him again, never hear him live again. This moment, right now, was the end of an era. Frank finished the song. The final note hung in the air, then silence, complete silence. The audience sat frozen, not wanting to break the moment, not wanting it to be over. Then someone started clapping, then another person, then the whole room erupted. Standing ovation. People weren't just applauding, they were cheering, crying, reaching toward the stage. Some of them had seen Frank perform in the 1940s, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. They'd grown up with his voice, married to his songs, raised their children listening to his records, and now they were saying goodbye. Frank stood there taking it in, the applause, the love, the appreciation. He raised his hand in thanks, tipped his fedora, and walked off stage. Nancy met him in the wings. "Dad, that was beautiful." Frank didn't respond. He seemed dazed, exhausted. He'd given everything he had out there. There was nothing left. "Dad, are you okay?" Frank looked at her. For a moment, Nancy wasn't sure if he recognized her. Then his eyes focused. "I'm tired, baby. I'm so tired. Come on, let's get you back to the hotel." They walked slowly to the dressing room. Frank's assistant helped him out of his tuxedo and into comfortable clothes. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? Everyone knew this was the last performance. Frank knew it. Nancy knew it. The audience had known it. The only question was whether Frank would admit it. Back at the hotel, Frank sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the desert night. Nancy sat with him. "That's it, isn't it?" Frank said quietly. "That's the last time I'll ever perform." Nancy wanted to argue, to tell him he'd get stronger, his memory would improve, there would be more concerts, but she couldn't lie to him. "Yeah, Dad, I think that's it." Frank nodded slowly. "You know what's strange? I thought I'd feel sad, but I don't. I just feel ready. I've been doing this for 50 years, Nancy. 50 years of performing, of being Frank Sinatra, and I'm tired. I'm ready to rest." "What will you do now?" Frank smiled. "I don't know. Spend time with family, sit in the sun, read books I never had time to read, watch my grandchildren grow up, be a person instead of a legend for a while." "You'll always be a legend, Dad." "Maybe, but I'd like to just be Frank for the time I have left. Not Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board. Just Frank, the kid from Hoboken who got lucky and had a hell of a ride." They sat in silence for a while. Then Nancy said, "Earlier, backstage, you said something to me. You said, 'They're all waiting for me now. Dean, Sammy, Ava, they're all waiting.'" Frank looked confused. "I said that?" "Yeah. Do you remember?" Frank thought about it. "No, but it sounds like something I'd say." He paused. "They are, waiting for me. Dean's probably got a drink ready. Sammy's got a joke lined up. And Ava..." Frank's voice trailed off. Ava's probably sitting there looking beautiful and dangerous, wondering what took me so long. Nancy took her father's hand. You really loved her, didn't you? After all these years, after everything. I loved them all, baby. Your mother, Ava, Mia, Barbara. But Ava was different. Ava was the one who got away, the one I could never quite hold on to. And maybe that's why I loved her most, because she was always just out of reach. Do you think you'll see her again? When your time comes? Frank smiled. I don't know if there's anything after this, but if there is, yeah, I think I'll see her, and Dean, and Sammy, and all the others who went before me, and we'll have one hell of a party. The conversation drifted to other things, memories, stories, things Frank wanted Nancy to know, advice for her career, messages for his other children. It wasn't a goodbye, not exactly, but it had the weight of one. Frank was setting things in order, making peace with the end. 3 years later, on May 14th, 1998, Frank Sinatra died. He was 82 years old. He'd been in declining health for months. The final heart attack came quickly. His wife Barbara was with him. His children rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Frank was already gone. The world mourned. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in tribute. The Empire State Building was lit in blue, Frank's signature color. Radio stations played his music nonstop. Newspapers ran retrospectives of his life and career. President Clinton issued a statement calling Frank the voice of the century. But for those who'd been at that final performance in Palm Desert in 1995, the mourning had started 3 years earlier, because that night, February 25th, 1995, was when they'd really lost Frank Sinatra. The man who died in 1998 was just the body, the spirit, the voice, the legend. That had left the stage on that final note of My Way. At Frank's funeral, Nancy gave a eulogy. She talked about her father's career, his impact on music, his generosity to friends and family, his complicated, fascinating, difficult, wonderful life. And then she told a story. 3 nights before he died, Dad was in and out of consciousness, but he had a moment of clarity. He opened his eyes, looked at me, and said, Nancy, I want you to know something. That last concert, February 95, when I sang My Way and walked off that stage, that was the happiest moment of my life. Nancy paused, composing herself. I was surprised. I said, Dad, happier than winning your Oscars? Than topping the charts? Than all those sold-out shows? And he said, all of that was great, but that final performance, I got to say goodbye on my own terms. I got to walk off that stage under my own power, with dignity, with the audience loving me. How many performers get that? How many people get to choose their ending? I did. I got to end it my way. The funeral attendees, celebrities, politicians, mobsters, musicians, friends, and family sat in silence, absorbing that. Frank Sinatra, who'd done everything his own way his entire life, had even managed to orchestrate his own ending. That final performance hadn't been a sad decline. It had been a choice, a statement, a perfectly Sinatra way to go out. After the funeral, there was a private reception. Dean Martin's daughter came up to Nancy. Your father and my father, they were something, weren't they? They really were. Do you think they're together now, wherever they are? Nancy smiled through her tears. I think they're at a bar somewhere, having a drink, telling jokes, and planning their next show. And I think my dad is probably saying, okay, here's how we're gonna do this. We're gonna do it my way. The woman laughed. That sounds exactly right. Years later, music historians would analyze that final performance. They'd note the cracking voice, the forgotten lyrics, the obvious decline. Some would call it sad, pathetic even. An old man who should have quit years earlier, holding on too long. But they'd be wrong, because that performance wasn't about vocal perfection or hitting every note. It was about something bigger. It was Frank Sinatra, at the end of his life, standing on a stage and bearing witness to everything he'd been, every success, every failure, every triumph, every regret, and saying through his cracked, failing voice, I lived, I really lived, and I did it my way. The recording of that final performance exists. It's not officially released, the family keeps it private, but those who've heard it say it's heartbreaking and beautiful. You can hear Frank struggling, you can hear the years catching up with him, but you can also hear something else, a kind of peace, an acceptance. A man who'd lived a huge, impossible, legendary life and was ready for it to be over. The final words Frank Sinatra ever sang to an audience were from My Way. The record shows I took the blows and did it my way. The record does show that. 79 years of life, 50-plus years of performing, hundreds of albums, millions of records sold, 9 Grammys, an Academy Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, connections to presidents, mobsters, and everyone in between, 3 divorces, 4 marriages, 3 children, 6 grandchildren, countless affairs, legendary friendships, epic feuds, triumph, scandal, comeback, legacy. Frank Sinatra took the blows, and he did it his way, until February 25, 1995, when he walked off a stage in Palm Desert for the last time, tipped his fedora to the audience, and went home. 3 years later, when his heart finally gave out, Frank Sinatra wasn't afraid. According to those who were there, he seemed almost relieved, ready. The performance was over, the curtain had fallen, and Frank could finally rest. His last words, spoken to his wife Barbara hours before he died, were, "I'm losing." Not, "I'm dying." Not, "I'm afraid." Just, "I'm losing." Like life was a fight, and Frank had gone as many rounds as he could, but now it was time to let go. And so he did. Frank Sinatra, the voice, the chairman of the board, old Blue Eyes, took his final bow. The greatest performer of the 20th century left the stage, and somewhere, if there's anything after this, Dean and Sammy and Ava were waiting with a drink and a smile, ready to welcome him home. February 25, 1995, Frank Sinatra took the stage for the last time. His voice cracked, his memory failed him, but when he sang "My Way," the audience cried, because they knew they'd never see him again. And they were right, they never did. But they'd been there for the ending. They'd witnessed the final performance. They'd seen Frank Sinatra say goodbye on his own terms, in his own way. And for a legend like Frank, there was no better ending than that.